God's foreknowledge of free human decisions and actions. Now, the open theists do not deny the reality or importance of predictive prophecy, but they believe that when God reveals future events, He is doing one of the following. 1. Announcing His own plans, what He intends to do. 2. Speaking in very general terms that could be fulfilled by a great many states of affairs. 3. Announcing events that are necessary or highly probable, consequences of past and present states of affairs. Or 4. Announcing what will take place if certain conditions obtain. What the open theists are concerned to deny, however, is that God foreknows the free decisions of human beings. On the open theists' libertarian view, such divine foreknowledge destroys human freedom. As Robert Strimple points out, to deny that God knows the free decisions of men is no small reduction in the Church's traditional view of God's knowledge. It is not a modest or limited proposal, as Clark Pinnock and Richard Rice seem to think. Either they are disingenuous or they have not thought through sufficiently the implications of their position. Think about it. Just how limited is the part of the world's ongoing history that we are asked to see as not under God's control, nor even within His present knowledge? How many truly significant occurrences in our world are not the actions of human beings or the consequences of such actions? Pinnock and Rice give us surprisingly few specific examples of such occurrences, preferring to speak vaguely of divine actions that are not dependent upon circumstances in the creaturely world. Perhaps the fact that the sun will shine on my picnic tomorrow would be one such event. But even a natural phenomenon such as whether or not tomorrow will be sunny in Southern California may well be determined by how much smog has been produced by how many automobiles whose drivers decided to turn on the ignition key in the past several days. And of course, at a global level, how could God know it is absolutely certain that someone would not have made this planet uninhabitable before tomorrow by recklessly unleashing a nuclear holocaust? In the following discussion, I shall mention some passages that, in my opinion, cannot be understood in terms of the above four categories, and that show God's absolute foreknowledge of human free acts. In my list must be included the passages in chapter 8 that show God as foreordaining free acts of human beings. If He foreordains, again He must foreknow. But note also the following. In Genesis chapter 9, verses 24 through 27, Noah, speaking as a prophet of God, indicates the future of 2 sons and a grandson. Clearly, the prophecy is intended to describe not the earthly lives of these individuals, but the history of their descendants. The grandson, Canaan, is to be a slave of Noah's sons Shem and Japheth. Yahweh is to be blessed as God of Shem, and Japheth will live in the tents of Shem. The importance of this prophecy in Moses' history is certainly that the Shemites, Semites, Israel, will conquer Canaan, and that all the nations, Japhethites, will be blessed. Compare Genesis chapter 12, verse 3, through Shem. This prophecy does not begin to be fulfilled until Israel's conquest of Canaan many centuries later, and the specific form of the blessing to Japheth does not become evident until Jesus sends His disciples to bring the gospel to all nations, Matthew chapter 28, verse 19. So the prophecy of Noah predicts events many centuries in advance, but it also anticipates free actions of human beings. The prophecy cannot be fulfilled unless the family of Shem develops into a nation capable of defeating the family of Canaan in battle. For that to happen, countless marriages and births must take place, as well as much cultural development, geopolitical events putting Israel and Canaan into proximity, hostility between them, military power in Israel, and above all, Israel's putting its faith in the true God. And the blessing on Japheth presupposes that the Japhethites will hear of the God of Israel and will freely put their trust in Him. So the fulfillment of Noah's prophecy requires millions of free human decisions. In giving Noah those words, God foreknew that those free decisions would take place. So God's covenant with Abraham also anticipates free human decisions. Then the Lord said to Abram, "Know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs, and will be servants there, and they will be afflicted for 400 years. And they shall come back here in the 4th generation, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete." Genesis chapter 15, verses 13 through 16. As we learn from later narratives in Genesis, Abraham's descendants, several centuries later, become strangers in Egypt because of the betrayal of Joseph by his brothers, Joseph's walk with God that elevates him to a position of authority, Jacob's decision to move to Egypt, and the rise of a Pharaoh hostile to the Jews. All these events take place through the free decisions of human beings, of Joseph, his brothers, Jacob, the Pharaohs. And of course, the return of Israel to Canaan is also a complicated story about human free decisions, a story written by the hand of God. Genesis chapter 45 verses 5 through 8 and chapter 50 verse 20. When God predicts these events, He is also predicting the human free decisions necessary to bring these events about. Similarly, the prophecies of Isaac, Genesis chapter 27 verses 27 through 29, 39, and 40, and Jacob, who gathers his children, that I may tell you what shall happen to you in days to come, chapter 49 verse 1, the Balaam oracles, Numbers chapters 23 and 24, the Song of Moses, Deuteronomy chapter 32 verses 1 through 43, and the blessing of Moses on the tribes of Israel, Deuteronomy chapter 33 verses 1 through 29. 1 Samuel chapter 10 verses 1 through 7 is Samuel's prophecy of very specific events that we saw earlier. Note now that these events require free human decisions. Samuel says that Saul will meet 2 men near Rachel's tomb, verse 2, not 3, not 1. Evidently, each man made a free decision to travel that road, and the 2 freely agreed to walk together. They also freely decided what to say to Saul, but Samuel knew in advance what they would say. Then Samuel identifies the next group that will meet Saul, exactly how many there will be, exactly what they will be carrying, and what Saul will do in response. Again, Samuel knows in advance, because the Lord knows in advance, what free decisions these people will make. Similarly, through the narrative. In 1 Samuel chapter 23 verse 12, God tells David that if he stays in Keilah, the citizens will turn him over to Saul. Presumably, the decision of the inhabitants of Keilah is a free one, but God knows what that free decision would be. Now, this is a conditional prophecy and thus might be thought to be in the open theist category 4. David's betrayal will occur only on the condition that he stays in Keilah. But God is not here saying what He, God, will do on that condition. Rather, He is saying what the Keilahites will do, what their free decision will be. God's knowledge, even conditional knowledge of a human free act, does not cohere with the system of open theism. In 1 Kings chapter 13 verses 1 through 4, an unnamed prophet from the southern kingdom of Judah comes to Jeroboam, ruler of the northern kingdom of Israel, and rebukes his false worship. O altar, altar, thus says the Lord, Behold, a son shall be born to the house of David, Josiah by name, and he shall sacrifice on you the priests of the high places who make offerings on you, and human bones shall be burned on you. 1 Kings chapter 13 verse 2. Jeroboam reigned in approximately 931 to 910 BC, Josiah 639 to 609. So the prophecy foretells an event 300 years in the future, mentioning Josiah by name, foretelling his actions. The prophecy also implies much about Josiah's values. He is to be a champion of the true worship of Yahweh. The prophecy anticipates many human free decisions, the marriages, conceptions, and births that lead to Josiah, the name given to him, the plot that elevated him to the kingship, 2 Kings chapter 21 verses 23 and 24, Josiah's training in character, his decision to repair the temple, chapter 22 verses 1 through 7, his response to the rediscovery of the law, verses 11 through 20, his renewal of the covenant, chapter 23 verses 1 through 3. In 2 Kings chapter 8 verse 12, the prophet Elisha sadly tells Hazael, king-to-be of Syria, that Hazael will do great harm to Israel. You will set on fire their fortresses, and you will kill their young men with the sword and dash in pieces their little ones and rip open their pregnant women. These are to be Hazael's free decisions foreknown by God. Hazael himself considers them unlikely, verse 13. Perhaps the open theist will object that any Syrian king would do these things, granted the historical circumstances, so this passage would fall under category 3 of the 4 listed earlier. These are human decisions rendered necessary by historical situations. If the open theist takes this option, however, He thereby concedes that Hazael's decisions were not free in the libertarian sense, and that therefore Hazael was not morally responsible for his heinous actions. One hopes that open theists are not so generous to more recent practitioners of genocide. But the passage illustrates well a dilemma facing the open theist. He must conclude from this passage either that God foreknew Hazael's free decision or that Hazael was not a free agent. Neither conclusion is consistent with the theory of open theism. According to Psalm 139, verse 4, God knows our words altogether before they are on our tongues. Also, in your book were written, every one of them, the days that were formed for me, when as yet there was none of them. Psalm 139, verse 16b. Does this mean that God foreknows all the events of the days of our lives, or only that He knows the number of days allotted to us? Even if the psalmist intends only the latter in this passage, he is attributing to God a profound foreknowledge of human free decisions. Length of life depends on a great many human decisions of our parents and caregivers during our childhood, our decisions affecting health and diet, decisions to become involved in dangerous activities, decisions creating friendships and enmities, decisions of friends to rescue us, decisions of enemies to pursue aggression, and, most of all, decisions as to our values, for divine wisdom brings length of life. Proverbs chapter 3, verse 2. We saw that 1 Kings chapter 13, verses 1 through 4 refers to Josiah by name 300 years before his birth. Similarly, Isaiah chapter 44, verse 28 through chapter 45, verse 13, and most likely chapter 46, verse 11, refers to Cyrus, the Persian king who authorized the return of Israel from exile to Canaan. Isaiah prophesied in Judah during reigns of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, chapter 1, verse 1, in the 8th and 7th centuries B.C. Cyrus conquered Babylon around 539 B.C. and ruled it until around 530, the late 6th century. So Isaiah's prophecy anticipates Cyrus's birth, name, conquest, rule, character, and numerous free decisions over a century in advance. In Jeremiah chapter 1, verse 5, Yahweh says that He knew the prophet before his conception and appointed him as a prophet. So God knew that of all the marriages in Israel and all the various combinations of sperm and egg, one would produce a specific individual named Jeremiah, equipped in advance to be a prophet. Many free human decisions led to the conception of Jeremiah in his mother's womb, and God knew all those decisions in advance. Jeremiah himself, in chapter 37, verses 6 through 10, reports in advance the free decisions of the Egyptian and Babylonian military leaders, opposing the predictions of rival pundits, verses 9 and 10. For similar prophecies, see chapter 25, verse 9, and chapter 39, verses 15 through 18. In chapter 25, verse 11, he says that Judah's captivity will last 70 years. Ezekiel also sets forth some future actions of the king of Babylon in great detail. Chapter 21, verses 18 through 23, chapter 26, verses 1 through 14, and chapter 30, verse 10. And Daniel's predictions of the history of empires, Daniel chapters 2, 9, and 11, anticipate innumerable free decisions by rulers, soldiers, peoples, giving timetables for sequences of historical events centuries in advance. In the New Testament, Jesus teaches that His Father knows the day and hour of His coming, Mark chapter 13, verse 32. But that day, we learn, will not come until after other events have taken place, events involving human free decisions, chapter 13, verses 1 through 30. So God knows in advance that those decisions will be made, and He knows when they will have been made. Compare Jesus' prophecy of the destruction of the temple in Matthew chapter 24, verse 2. Jesus knew in advance that some people would freely decide to destroy God's house. Jesus also knew in advance who would betray Him, Matthew chapter 26, verse 24. In this passage, the open theist may not respond that Judas's acts were determined by existing conditions known by Jesus and therefore were not free. For Jesus makes it clear that Judas is responsible for his action. So on the open theist theory, Judas's act must have been free and therefore unpredictable. But in fact, Jesus predicted it. Compare John chapter 6, verse 64, and chapter 13, verses 18 and 19. In John chapter 13, verse 38, Jesus also predicts Peter's threefold denial, an act for which Peter later takes full responsibility. So, in Acts chapter 2, verse 23, Peter ascribes the events of Jesus' death to the definite plan and foreknowledge of God, noting also the responsibility of the lawless men. Compare Acts chapter 4, verses 27 and 28. Jesus knows in advance what kind of death Peter will die. John chapter 21, verses 18 and 19. Before his death, Peter will be dressed and led somewhere against his will. So again, Jesus indicates his foreknowledge of free human actions. Passages alleged to teach